Have you just finished your first quilt top and you're ready to turn it into a quilt with those nice quilting stitches? If it's big, someone might have said to you, oh, you should get it long-armed, or you should take it to a longarmer. And you're wondering, what on earth is a longarmer or a longarm? If so, this is the video for you. I'm going to explain what a longarm is, why you might want to send your quilt to a longarmer, and then show you step by step what happens to your quilt top at the longarmers as they turn it into a quilt. Let's get started. First thing, let's talk about what a long arm machine is. If you plan to quilt your quilt on your domestic machine, which is your regular old sewing machine at home, is called a domestic machine. When you are sewing in the middle of the quilt, there's going to be all this extra that you have to shove in here under the arm of the machine. It starts to get a little unwieldy, especially as the quilt gets bigger. A long arm machine is an industrial type machine, and you can see that the space here is very big. It has a long arm here. This is not something that most quilters are going to want to get. First of all, because they cost about as much as a car, and second of all, because you can see they're quite big. They take up an awful lot of room in your home. The cost and the space is usually why you see long arm machines only in quilt stores or in the homes of people who are making it their business to quilt other people's quilt with this machine that they've bought. Although you can often rent time on these machines in quilt stores, if this is your first top, you might just want to send it off to a longarmer who's already experienced. It is quite a lot of additional knowledge to learn, especially when you've just learned how to piece. I am a quilter who actually has my own long arm machine here in my house, and I don't do other people's quilts. I did have a business back in the early 2000s in which I did do other people's quilts, so I have a little bit of experience, and I'm just going to walk you through doing a quilt that a family member has sent to me to be long-armed by me. This will give you an understanding of what happens when you send your quilt top off to a longarmer and the things that you should know before you send it. This is the quilt top and the quilt backing that has been sent to me. She also provided the batting for me and sent that to me as well. Many longarmers actually buy batting in bulk. You can see here, this is my roll of batting that I have that I use for my own quilts. But if you send a quilt off to a longarmer to be quilted, they will often provide batting for a fee. This is usually a very good deal. They get good deals on the batting, high quality batting that will work well for their machine and for you. Most long arm quilters will require that your backing be at least 4 or 5 inches bigger than your top all the way around. You will see why that is as I load the quilt later, but for this quilt, this is me checking to make sure the sizes are correct. First, I measured the backing that she sent me, and you can see that it's 83 by 100. And then I measured the top, which is 77 by 92. So that's enough extra space all the way around the quilt. So 4 or 5 inches all the way around the quilt means 8 to 10 inches longer in each direction. And you can see I've made a little note to know exactly how to load it on the machine. When you send a quilt off to a longarmer, it's really helpful for you to mark for them where the top of the backing and where the top of the top is. This makes it easier for them to load in the right direction for you. The next step before I loaded this quilt was to pick a thread color. Many longarmers will do this for you. In this case, since it's a family member, I gave her 3 choices and laid it out on the quilt so that she could see and pick which of these threads she wanted to use. And you'll notice here that I compared the thread both on the top and on the back. Many longarmers are really going to want you to use the same thread color on both the front and the bobbin. So you want to make sure you send a backing that goes well with the quilt, that the same color thread will blend in nicely or contrast nicely, whichever you want, on both pieces. Now let's start loading this quilt on the long arm. The first step is to load the backing on. I will speed through this occasionally as I'm working on it. You can see that it's going to take a little bit of time to get this backing loaded, but you load it onto 2 rollers here. You can see that it's important that these edges on the top and then the bottom of your backing are nice and straight so that your long armor can line them up nicely and your back will be nice and straight and square. Okay, so I got the top of the backing attached and you can see it's wrong side up. When a long armor loads it on, they need to make sure the backing is nice and even and to roll it up on this roller back here. And again, it helps if you've told your long armor that this is the top so that it makes it easier for them to load. They don't have to wonder if everything's going to fit if they know what is the top. It is a little more important on the front of the quilt because any quilting designs you put on might have a direction and you'd want to know what the top of the quilt is. You may think it's really obvious, but it won't be. They are not you. They are just quilting your quilt. And then the backing gets attached the same way to the roller on the other side of the machine. And again, this is just so you know what is happening when it goes to the long armor. This is not a course on long arming. It's been a long time since I did long arming as a business, and I've only had this new machine in the past year and haven't actually done that many quilts on it yet. So there may be long armors in the comments that tell me I'm doing something wrong, but this is the general process for you. So in terms of having a backing ready for a long armor, you want to make sure it's big enough all around, and then also that the top and the bottom, you've straightened them out and they're square to the sides so it's easy for them to load. And again, many long armors will provide batting for you for a fee. You can see that I'm putting each layer on independently on the machine. And this is why you don't want to baste your layers together. The long armor needs them separate in order to put them on the machine. And now I'm actually going to turn the machine on. Long arm machines have bottom load bobbins. They're very similar to regular bottom load machines. Their bobbins are just a little bit bigger. And just like your regular machine, it's important to keep them clean. Long arms need a lot of maintenance and care, and you have to be pretty comfortable with fixing tension problems and things like that. So when you are paying a long armor, you are also paying for their experience, both with quilting and with the machine. Just like you wanted the backing attached nice and square, you also want to have your top attached nice and square. So you'll probably see when your quilt comes back from the long armor, this little line of stitching across the top of the batting. I'm going to be lining my quilt top up on that line of stitching. And again, it's really helpful for your long armor if the top of the quilt is marked. I failed to tell my family member about this, and she told me what the top was, and it just took me a little bit of time to figure out what she was talking about. But I did finally figure it out, and this is the top of the quilt. Another thing I should say is you can see that the edge of this quilt is not squared off. I think your long armor probably would want you to do that. I told my family member that no, she didn't need to do that. I'm perfectly happy to do the edge as well, but it does add a little bit of extra work. A long armor bastes the edges down both to hold it in place, but also to make sure all these edges are held down so when the machine goes on and off the edges, it doesn't catch an edge and sew it down the wrong way. So when you get your quilt back, you will see that the edges are all basted down. That kind of helps for when you're putting the binding on, because you are still responsible for putting on the binding unless you have a longarmer that offers that service and pay a little extra to do that. I'm going to be putting a pantograph, an all-over pattern on this, but before I start showing you how I'm going to do that, I'm going to talk about the different types of quilting that longarmers do and the different charges there are for it. Most of the time when you get a quilt long-armed, you're going to get a type of pattern put on it called edge to edge or a pantograph. And that is a pattern that's the same all over the quilt. They're usually done in rows across like this. You can't really see the pattern unless you really look for it. But for example, here's a big flower, and you go down, and here's another big flower. So that's the extent of the pattern, but you can see it's nested in, so it doesn't really look like stripes across the quilt. Nowadays, these patterns are usually created using a computer to guide the machine so that it's perfect across the quilt. Very nice, neat, precise matches of things in the pattern. Back 20 years ago, when I had my first long arm, computerized machines weren't as available, and so I did most of my all-over patterns freehand, and some quilters still do things freehand. So in this case, you can see this pattern is an all-over pattern, but it's not done by the machine, so it's a little more random. The longarmer uses the machine to draw and go around from place to place and create the pattern. So this is an edge-to-edge pantograph, and this is an edge-to-edge, but it's freehand. One thing that's important to know is that straight lines are a lot harder to do on a long arm. Something like stitching in the ditch or doing these nice straight lines from point to point requires something called ruler quilting, and it's just a lot more labor intensive. It's usually something called custom quilting. Custom quilting is something more like this. I did a freehand flower in the middle, and then on the edge, I did a whole bunch of ruler quilting. On this quilt here, this is lots of ruler quilting here, all these precise curves and the straight lines. And then this is freehand quilting in the middle here. So something that's quilted like this would be called custom quilting, and it would be a lot more expensive than something like this because this is less time intensive. So this is the kind of thing I'm going to put on that quilt that's on my machine. This involves using the computer that's attached to my machine. And you can see there are lots of different patterns out there to choose from. Your longarmer might have specific patterns they offer. They might also say that you can pay for a different pattern if there's a pattern that you find somewhere that you'd much rather use. Your longarmer has to have some computer expertise in order to do this. You can see that I've initially put this pattern on, and it's just lines of patterns. You wouldn't want that to be on your quilt, so I need to make some adjustments. And then after the adjustments, you can see that it looks more like an all-over pattern. I also have to look at whether that's the appropriate density for this quilt. One thing you want to make sure of when you send your quilt off to the longarmer is to make sure that you clip any threads, especially on the front. If the machine comes along and catches this, it can then create a little loop that the foot can get caught in and cause big problems on your quilt. So a longarmer will have to be clipping off any of these threads that she comes across. So do that for her. I think there's an impression with a computerized long arm that your longarmer isn't actually doing anything, and you should know that they are watching things. They're making sure nothing gets caught up and no disasters happen on your quilt. And also, you need to advance between rows. So the machine has just finished a row, and so I need to advance the quilt forward. To undo clamps, move the machine out of the way. And then check everything underneath to make sure the batting is nice and smooth. Also checking the backing. I'm clipping any loose threads that I find on the quilt so that the machine doesn't get hung up on them. And just generally making sure everything looks right. I need to baste down the sides here so that the machine doesn't catch them and they stay in place. In the middle of this last row, I actually had to change my bobbin thread because it takes several bobbins to do a quilt. The number of bobbins it takes depends on how big the quilt is and also how complicated the pattern is as well. Every time you start and stop, you need to bring up your bobbin thread so it's nice and neat. And now I need to tell the machine and the computer where the pattern is. To line up something on the previous row with the machine, and then find it on the computer and tell the computer where the needle is now. To set up the next row, and now the computer's moving the machine to the next spot. I have to set it up, bring up the needle thread again, and then it's on its way again. But I have to do this for every row of the quilt. I don't know how many passes this quilt is going to take, but it's quite a few. And when all the passes are done, and the quilt is at the very bottom, it can come off the machine. As you can see, as we went, it all got rolled onto here as it got finished, and so we can just unroll it like that. So that's what a long arm is and what happens when you send it to a long armer or if you rent time on a machine yourself. It's certainly a whole lot easier than putting it through your regular sewing machine, though that is possible. It does cost money to rent time on a long arm machine in a quilting store or to actually hire a long armer to do your quilt. So it's a trade-off between having to deal with putting it through your own machine and the strain and effort that takes, or the money. I hope this explains for you what a long armer does with a long arm machine. Happy sewing!